أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. صدر قرار وقامت كامالا هاريس المرشحة عن الحزب الديمقراطي باختيار مرشح الحزب الديمقراطي لمنصب نائب الرئيس، وهو تيم ووالز من ولاية مينيسوتا. وسينافس الاثنان معا دونالد ترامب والسناتور فانس لتحديد من سيحكم البيت الأبيض في السنوات الأربعة المقبلة. من هو تيم ووالز؟ ولماذا اختارته هاريس؟ وما الذي سيضيفه إلى الحملة الانتخابية؟ وما هي نقاط ضعفه؟ وهل هناك مواقف قد يختلف فيها مع رئيساته في المستقبل؟ وهل هو شخص يتخوف منه الجمهوريون أم أنهم مسرورون باختيارها له؟ لبحث موضوع اختيار الحزب الديمقراطي لنائب الرئيس وتأثير ذلك على انتخابات نوفمبر الرئاسية، يسرني أن أستضيف نخبة من الخبراء السياسيين تود جيلمان، جيسيكا تايلور وميني راكر.
Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Politicians from the great state of Minnesota don't have a great track record on the presidential ticket. Gene McCarthy, Walter Mondale, Harold Stassen, and now we have a fourth, Tim Walz. Is he going to change that? Well, let's discuss his candidacy to be the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket and what this means for our November election. I'm delighted to welcome Todd Gilman, Minnie Racker, and Jessica Taylor. Thanks for joining me today. So, Todd, who is Tim Walz and why is he Kamala Harris's nominee to be vice president?
Well, Tim Walz is not a household name outside of Minnesota. Certainly wasn't before this week when the vice president picked him to be her running mate. He served in Congress for 6 terms, 12 years. He's been elected as governor of Minnesota twice. He spent almost 3 decades as a high school teacher. He was a state champion football coach. He was in the Minnesota National Guard, and so he has a military background that Democrats really value and valued very much at the time during the Iraq War when he first ran for Congress. He served as a command sergeant major, which is, I believe, the highest non-officer rank in the military, which is pretty unusual, and it sets him up to be a very interesting foil with Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, who, like Tim Walz, rose from fairly humble beginnings. But Vance, of course, went on to Yale Law School, probably the most elite law school in the country. Whereas Governor Walz ended up in public schools, teaching, doing public service. He is the same age as Kamala Harris, so obviously there's a generational affinity there, and both of them are one generation younger than Trump and one generation older than J.D. Vance, which gives them a lot of opportunities for contrasts.
So, Minnie, we've seen enormous energy with the Kamala Harris nomination since the switch from President Biden to the vice president as the nominee. Does Tim Walz add to that, detract to that, or neither?
My opinion is that Tim Walz is Tim probably the best pick that Harris could have made. So as she was deciding who she was going to be running with, we saw this kind of compressed Veep stakes search. And Walz got praise from a huge variety of people, union leaders, progressives, It's seen as an appeal to the left in picking Walz. But the thing is, he also has this image as this rural gun owner, nice guy who can maybe win over some moderates just with that image alone. So I think Harris is sticking with the theme of keeping the party united, not attracting criticism from any of its wings. Some of the people who she was reportedly also considering had real downsides. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, for instance, got a lot of criticism from progressives. And we're seeing a pick here that's, getting praise from everyone from Joe Manchin, the independent senator from West Virginia, to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So she's really, I think, done a good job keeping the momentum going and not getting it caught up on a potentially problematic VP pick.
So, Jessica, everyone has downsides. What are the disadvantages of a Tim Walz pick, or are there really no downsides?
I mean, I think the disadvantages was that he did not come from a critical swing state. Minnesota has voted Democratic back to the 70s. This is a state that perhaps the Trump administration talked about, the Trump campaign talked about challenging, trying to compete in, but that was when Biden was atop the ticket. Its electoral votes are not really in doubt, whereas the other two reported finalists, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania and Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, did come from really key battleground states. I think it's also just that he balances out in, I think, terms of bringing someone from the Midwest. And even though he's from Minnesota, I think there's a lot of similarities of Minnesota to other swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin in particular. But I think the Trump campaign has already raised questions, about his military service and the time he retired before his unit was deployed to Iraq, timings about that. And then, he was sort of seen as a centrist in the House. He was elected he ousted a Republican incumbent in 2006, sort of in the wake of backlash to the Iraq war. But it really, after 2022, when he was reelected governor, he did push a more progressive agenda after the legislature they had a trifecta with the House and the State House and the State Senate became in Democratic hands. And then I think the one thing that Republicans have zeroed in the most, that perhaps has the most attention, is after the 2020 murder of George Floyd, the riots that happened in Minneapolis. There's criticism that he was too slow to deploy the National Guard. He even in retrospect has said that, decisions that he may have made differently. We've already sort of seen those images being used to attack him. And, given, I think, Republican strength when it comes to issues of crime and Democratic vulnerabilities, I think that's something that could be a detraction from the ticket. But the caveat that I would add is that there's little evidence that the running mate can make a big difference. There was immediate, Republicans I talked to leading up to the pick, they were most worried about Shapiro just because there's virtually no path to winning the presidency without Pennsylvania's 19 electoral votes. And that he had such a resounding victory by 15 points, albeit against a weak opponent in 2022, that he would bring that strength and could deliver that state. But, would a running mate necessarily bring that elsewhere? I think sometimes the pick is sort of do no harm in a way. And I'm not sure Walz harms the ticket. I think that, again, things like what happened in Minneapolis are going to be ripe for Democratic attacks or for Republican attacks. But I still think it comes down to who is at the top of the ticket and not the vice presidential slot.
All right. So just before we get back to the top of the ticket, Tim Walz versus J.D. Vance. This is a fascinating contrast. It'll make a terrific debate when they eventually, hopefully, have at least one national debate. Both Midwesterners, but very different paths, as you suggested earlier, Todd. Do you think Republicans are having any second thoughts about the J.D. Vance choice in light of the contrast between Tim Walz and Vance?
Well, even before Vice President Harris picked the governor as her running mate, there were indications that if Republicans aren't having second thoughts about it, that perhaps they should have second thoughts about it. There have been a lot of stumbles by J.D. Vance. There's a lot of very inflammatory rhetoric that he has said that has resurfaced in the context of him being on the ticket. Just as one very now notorious example, he has complained that Democrats who are in charge and who want to transform America effectively don't have any skin in the game. They don't have a stake in the future of America because so many of them don't have children. And he said it in a particularly colorful way by saying there are childless women who have cats at home who are the Democratic Party. This is not something that is a good calling card when so much of the electorate are suburban women, many of them single, some of them single moms, many of them single not parents. Just in one state in particular that I know a little bit more about than others, in Arizona, there was some statistical analysis done that the margin of loss for Trump last time around against Biden, there are in fact more childless women who have cats than the number of votes that Trump needs to make up just in that one state. So Vance has a very inflammatory way of speaking and a very divisive kind of approach. Walz, in contrast, as Jessica and others have said, he's kind of an everyman. I mean, he definitely skews to the left, and that will put off some number of people in the electorate who might have been maybe attracted to Harris if she had picked a more centrist running mate, such as Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania. But he also can relate. He has roots in rural America, in what we call flyover country, the very vast part of the country between the East Coast and the West Coast, which are so typically liberal. He can speak to the working class people in a way that Kamala Harris from California and a much more liberal background can't. So, as has been said, the running mates' first priority is do no harm, and ultimately they don't typically tip the election, but it's a factor and it's something that people think about and talk about. And Trump is in his upper 70s, and Kamala has very little governing experience of her own. So people do look to the running mate as an important indication of how the person at the top of the ticket makes very important decisions. And also, God forbid, I mean, we saw Trump, an assassination attempt just a few weeks ago. It is critically important who their understudy is.
So just to pursue this a little bit, Minnie, age has certainly been a huge factor in this election. It's one of the factors that drove Joe Biden from running. Does J.D. Vance appeal to that critical younger electorate who stood on the sidelines while Joe Biden was still running? Is a 39-year-old, vigorous, young, high-tech, experienced former entrepreneur? Is he making any inroads in that all-important demographic?
So I think it remains to be seen, but he's certainly trying. Last week, he did a podcast appearance, for instance, with a popular group of young influencers where he kind of talked more casually about his personal experiences. He talked about how, like other millennials, he understands social media, so he runs his own X account, kind of to the chagrin of his staff. And I think he does have sort of a more accessible vibe than many older politicians that could appeal especially to young men who are kind of fed up with the state of current politics. That said, I think now having Harris on the other side really dampens the contrast that Vance could have presented, because, Harris is just about to turn 60. She looks young, she's energetic. And I think we're seeing a lot of young people who were pretty fed up with Biden become really interested in Harris, particularly those groups that have traditionally been more Democratic leaning, that were maybe curious about the Republican ticket, I think they're now kind of back on board with the Democrats.
And before we take a break and move to the campaign itself, Jessica, I just wanted to close one unfinished piece of business. Over the last several weeks, the top candidate for Harris to pick was widely assumed to be Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, and he sort of disappeared rather quickly. What happened to Mark Kelly?
I think that sometimes this pick comes down to who you have more chemistry with. And, Walz was absolutely the dark horse candidate. As someone that covers governors, I was maybe a little bit more familiar with Walz because he's been the chairman of the Democratic Governors Association in charge of electing more governors. But he's, as Todd said, he's not a household name. I've been surprised by non-political friends that were pulling for him in the past week. And there was sort of a meme that went around of, I'm so enthusiastic about Walz ever since I learned about him last week. I think that, some of the criticism has been that, I think Walz is someone. When I remember meeting with him earlier this year, he's very jovial. He's very funny. You've seen some of the, videos of him with his daughter writing things at the fair. I think he comes across as sort of this like everyman Midwest dad. And I think that Kelly didn't necessarily have that. He's an astronaut. He's very appealing. There was also a concern that this would open up a swing seat in 2026 as well. So I think there was an electoral consideration there. But I think ultimately it comes down to who do you vibe with necessarily. And, from reports, I think that Harris's interview with Walz just went better than some of the others. I think there was a concern too that you don't want the number 2 pick to overshadow you for people wishing that it was sort of the top of the ticket. And I think there were concerns that both with Kelly, he's very high profile, of course, the husband of Gabrielle Giffords that was, survived an assassination attempt herself over a decade ago, and that Shapiro were seen as perhaps more ambitious and that could have sort of overshadowed her. I think Walz is someone that's more comfortable sort of playing that second fiddle role, but still has, as you mentioned, a long experience in government, going back to being elected to Congress and then as governor. So he has both legislative and executive experience, but he brings something that was sort of unique to the ticket. And that, as you mentioned, he's been a public school teacher. He didn't come up through these like elite ranks and different things, that he has National Guard experience. So he sort of, I've kind of been referring to him as sort of the Goldilocks candidate, that he's, not too, he sort of fits that in a way. But I think for Harris, it came down to who are you most comfortable with? If you're elected, this is someone you have to work hand in hand with. You have to have lunches with every week. And I think it also helped that, as you mentioned, they're effectively the same age, that I think they come from a similar generation as well.
All right. When we come back after the break, now we're going to move our discussion to what the mad dash to November is going to look like. There's only a couple of months to go. We'll be back in just a moment. My guests again today include Todd Gilman. Todd recently joined the faculty of Arizona State University's School of Journalism. Previously, he spent over 30 years as a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, recently retiring as Washington bureau chief. Todd is past president of the Regional Reporters Association and was elected 3 times to the White House Correspondents Association board. Also with us is Minnie Racker. Minnie is politics reporter at the Daily Beast. Previously, she was a staff writer at Time magazine, where she covered the 2024 presidential primaries. And before that, she covered politics for the National Journal and the Los Angeles Times. And with us today is Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report, covering local and national politics. She's also the first woman senior author of the venerable Almanac of American Politics, a post she has held in both the 2022 and 2024 editions. Previously, Jessica reported for Inside Elections and National Public Radio. We have a couple of months left in this most unusual presidential campaign. Hundreds of millions of dollars have poured in to both campaigns. Lots of money to the Republicans after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Lots of money to Democrats after Kamala Harris took over the ticket. Todd, what are they going to do with all this money?
I wouldn't mind if they threw some my way. It'd be fine. It is an enormous amount of money. There are lots of things to spend money on in a presidential campaign. Even though there are really only about 7 battleground states, media costs money. Running television ads costs money in all of these markets that they want to run commercials in. Certainly the ground game, the get out the vote effort, going door to door sometimes even to make sure that people who have shown a previous propensity to vote for your party are registered to vote, and to remind them how important it is to vote. So that means staff, and staff adds up to salaries and a lot of money. It is a staggering amount of money, though.
And Minnie, with the changes in the nominees, it does suggest that the two campaigns are now going for what we used to call undecideds, not just trying to get out their base. Does that change the tenor of the campaign a bit?
You know, I think I actually have a slightly different take, which is I think Harris is a lot better at motivating the Democratic base than Biden was going to be. And I think that's really where she's focused so far, on young people, on people of color. I think something to note is that she hasn't been in a real contentious setting yet. She hasn't taken tough questions from reporters on camera. She hasn't gone anywhere where she isn't surrounded by adoring fans. Everywhere she's gone has been, Wilmington campaign headquarters, union events, Black sorority events, huge, halls full of, maybe like 14,000 supporters. So I don't think has shown yet whether she's actually trying to win over those undecideds or whether she is just trying to get people to actually turn out in the Democratic Party. She's said that she plans to take her campaign everywhere, and she does plan to win over those undecideds. But I don't think we've seen enough evidence yet to make sure that's really happening.
So, Jessica, if Minnie's right that Kamala Harris has not gone to inhospitable venues, Donald Trump did go to a very inhospitable venue, speaking before Black journalists not too long ago. From his perspective, did that work out well, do you think?
I'm not sure from his perspective it did, because they were doubling down on some of the things he said. But I talked with a lot of Republicans after that, and there was a lot of frustration with how that went. Certainly, I think that Trump was in a familiar rhythm with Biden, in that even though there's 3 years between them, that he came off as much younger, much more competent, especially after that debate. And then I think Harris has sort of knocked him off that game plan, and that you saw him attack her as not being really Black. And that was the headline that continues to persist. And that even at his rally that night, his campaign seemed to double down on it, putting up an article about how she was more identifying as an Indian American, when in fact she, as many people in the U.S., identify of dual heritage. That he was not talking about the economy, immigration.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for helping explain what the future is going to be like over the next mad rush of weeks before our November election. Todd Gilman, Jessica Taylor, Minnie Racker, thank you for joining me on Dakhel, Washington.
وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو استفسارات، وخاصة حول المنافسة بين نائبي الرئيسين، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.